Welcome back to Pondering in the Pines, guys. So, we're standing here in my front yard, actually, looking at one of my favorite spring forage treats. Now, if you're out in the forest, pine trees this time of year, as well as the spruce trees, are starting to put out these neon green sprouts, new pine needles for this year's growth. And these have a spectacular citrusy, minty, piney flavor. So today we're going to use some of these to make some pine soda. So it's oftentimes called Spruce Sprite. Has a very similar flavor. Now when we're picking these, you do want to do a little research, as with any wild foraging of plants, to make sure that the plants you're using aren't toxic, because there are a couple toxic trees, particularly lodgepole pine and yew pine, as well as the Norfolk pine, are going to be pretty toxic to humans. So those would be ones you definitely want to avoid. So do a little research, make sure you know what you're looking at. But this is going to be spruce. And the other thing that you want to make sure of for these wild recipes, particularly for this soda, is that there's no little bugs on your spruce. So you can see here we have these little tiny aphids. Now you can wash those off, but it's just easier to start with a spruce tip that doesn't have any bugs, because part of this recipe we're going to be utilizing the natural yeast that is already on the spruce tips. So every bit of this plant, and regional to where you are, is going to be its own little strain of yeast. And as the yeast eats the sugar in our soda recipe, it creates that fizzy texture, gives us a nice soda. So let's get to harvesting. All right, well, we have our spruce tips. Now, more is going to be required for this recipe because we're not cooking this mixture. So we really want enough spruce tips to adequately flavor our soda. Whereas if we were making mead or beer with these spruce tips, we could actually get by with a little less, because that's going to be cooked, and more of that flavor profile will actually get mixed in during that heating process. But the other reason we don't want to cook this is because we're working with wild yeast that's native and growing on these leaves. So if we were to cook it, we would kill that yeast, and that's not going to work out so well. Off to the kitchen. All right, guys, so we're ready for the next step. We got our bowl of pine needles. Now, we're going to do 2 different batches today, see which sweetener we end up liking more. And classically, I've done this with sugar, but you can also do this with honey. And it's pretty simple, really. We're just going to be stuffing pine needles, these new spruce tips, down into these jars. And we want the jar to be at least 1/3 full of our spruce tips. So this process is going to take us a couple minutes, but it's a really fun recipe to do with the kids. So if you have little ones at home, you make them feel like they're part of the kitchen magic. Go out and forage with them, spend a little time in nature, get them into the outdoors, and get them used to things that they can eat and produce food out of straight from nature itself. We're all about wild foods here. So once we're about 1/3 full for our bottles, we're just going to be adding a little bit of sugar to each one. So in this case, about a tablespoon of honey, and maybe about 1.5 tablespoons of white sugar. Now, this bottle is going to get honey, this bottle is going to get that sugar, and you don't want to go overboard with this. So again, we're working with wild yeasts here, and wild yeast is not going to be super alcohol tolerant, but part of the magic is that as it eats the sugar, which is one of its big dietary pieces, it creates carbon dioxide, which gives us that nice fizzy beverage. The pine needles are going to flavor it for us. And if we give too much sugar, that yeast goes a little crazy. Again, wild yeast won't ever get super alcoholic because it has a tendency to sterilize itself after a certain point. Too much alcohol, and it ends up killing itself with that. But now if we were making a beer, we'd be working on a very different recipe, but that actually could take a fair bit more sugar. Or mead recipes, honey wine, again, a fair bit more sugar for things like that. And then we're not worried so much about using the wild yeast. We're actually cooking these pine needles as part of the wort mixture. So again, that's a whole other recipe that you'll have to tune into the next episode of Pondering in the Pines for. We almost got our bottles filled up adequately. This kind of reminds me of being a kid. The square peg goes in the square hole, and the triangle peg goes in the triangle slot. Now for the honey one, we're going to add a little bit more of the pine needles because honey does have its own inherent flavor, and because this is a short mixture, short time brewing, we really don't want to overwhelm that pine flavor with the honey flavor. Now before you start doing this, these jars, these bottles have already been sanitized. Definitely you do want to sanitize the bottles that you're making your soda in. And if you have any brewing jugs at home, if you already do homebrew stuff, you can definitely use bigger vessels for this and create larger batches. But we're working on just small batches today. And if you don't have bottles like this, you can go to the store, and King Soopers carries a limeade that's going to come in a pressure top bottle. Sprouts, Whole Foods, they carry a fair few of those options as well. And even Trader Joe's will have some options where you can get yourself a nice drink to begin with, and then just go ahead and reuse that bottle. You don't have to special order these. Alright, so we've got our bottles packed full of our spruce tips. Now, if you don't have a funnel, you can actually make a funnel out of a piece of printer paper, roll it up into a funnel shape, and stick it in your bottle, and you're good to go. Now again, we don't want these to go crazy, so for the bottle that's getting the sugar, we're going to use about a tablespoon and a half, and that should give us some sweetness, but a nice strong carbonization. You might get a little bit of sugar left on top. Don't be too worried about that, just kind of brush it off. Now the honey one is a little bit more fun. We're actually going to see if we can get the honey to pour in without using a funnel, just to save us a little time. Now I fully expect this honey mixture to have a darker color when the soda is done, just because of that amber color of the honey is going to bleed into our mixture a little bit. But the one using sugar should be clear with maybe just a little tint of green from the pine needles. So it should give us something that looks almost identical to Sprite. All right, last step for this is going to be filtered water. So you do want to leave yourself a little headroom in these bottles. By headroom, I mean you don't want to fill the bottle all the way up with your filtered water, both because we need a little bit of space to shake the mixture up, and because this is going to be fermenting related to the natural yeasts that's in the spruce tips. So if you leave yourself a little bit of space up top, it prevents overpressurization of the bottles. About that much is going to be adequate. So a little bit of air up top. I'm just going to go ahead and clamp that down. Repeat the process with our bottle with the sugar. Now this is going to be a short ferment, so maybe 2 to 3 days tops. any longer than that, and it will start to get a little bit more alcoholic, but it's also going to run out of sugar to eat for that wild yeast on the spruce tips, and the mixture will go flat. So we want to have the best of both worlds. Now, a fun thing about this is you're not only making a soda for the kiddos, you're also making something that's pretty healthy. These spruce tips are going to be packed with vitamin C and vitamin A. Most pine trees are also going to be an anti-inflammatory, and there's going to be some prebiotics that's going on with this as well. So almost like a kombucha, but one that the kiddos will probably like. To finish things off, I'm just going to give it a good shake until all your sugar is dissolved. Or for the honey, we're going to shake it until we don't see any honey left on the neck of the bottle or on the spruce tips. Happens pretty fast. We're pretty much good to go already. Now this is going to be, this can just be set in a warm spot in your kitchen or on the dining room table. Makes a fun little centerpiece so you can watch it happening day by day. Now, important thing about this, I mentioned it's an active fermentation and that there is going to be carbonization happening. These bottles are going to get pressurized. So once a day, just go ahead and pop the top and let it off gas a little bit. That way you don't get too much pressure and either fizz out the top like a bottle of champagne or blow up your bottle. So we'll check back here in a couple days and see how our soda turned out. Thanks for joining us on Pondering in the Pines. And if you like these videos, guys, feel free to like and subscribe. We always love to hear what kind of wild foods you'd like to see us work on next.